Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep on a question that's kind of mind-blowing, and it seems like it's more and more relevant these days where we all just living in some kind of simulated society. It feels like something out of science fiction, but then when you look at all this stuff happening with AI and VR, it makes you think twice, right?
Yeah, it's wild how this idea has gone from like the fringe of sci-fi to a real debate. And what's really interesting to me is how all these sources, from philosophy papers to stuff about the latest tech, they all kind of point to different ways of even thinking about this whole question. Like statistically, could it be likely? Or what are the ethics of it all?
Exactly. You brought in Nick Bostrom's paper, the one that lays out the whole simulation argument. I got to admit, it's a tough read, but the basic idea is if there are these super advanced civilizations out there and they can create these hyper-realistic simulations, well, the odds are we're probably in one of those simulations instead of being the original real deal. It's kind of trippy to think about all these simulated worlds maybe existing out there.
It is. And what gets me about Bostrom's argument is that it doesn't rely on anything too out there. He's just saying, look, if we assume simulations are possible and civilizations tend to want to make them, then just by the numbers, there would have to be way more simulated realities than the original one.
So it's not about proving we're in a simulation, but more about, like, the probability of it, given where technology could be headed. But before we go too far down that path, I'm curious, how do the sources actually define what a simulated society even is? Can't just be like a super advanced video game, right?
Right. It's got to be way more complex than that. Your sources talk about the difference between immersive experiences like VR and all that, and a real simulated society where the people living inside have no clue they're in a simulation. Think of it like a digital world with its own rules, its own logic, where people have emotions, relationships, everything, and it feels totally real to them.
So it's like they're living in their own Truman Show, but like a whole society's worth of Truman Shows. And that makes me wonder, even if we could make a simulation that perfect, would it matter if we knew it was fake? Would the feelings and experiences be less real somehow?
Yeah, and that's where things get, philosophically messy. There's this one paper you sent about the ethics of artificial consciousness that really digs into that.
Hmm.
The argument is if these simulated beings are having real emotions, real relationships, then their reality is just as real as ours, even if it's all happening in a computer somewhere.
So even if it's code, the feelings are real. Okay, my brain is officially starting to hurt. But this source also brought up some serious ethical questions like, if we could make a simulated society, wouldn't we have some kind of responsibility for those beings?
Totally. This paper asks, would shutting down a simulation with conscious beings be basically like genocide? Would we have the right to mess with their world, their experiences, their whole existence? These are things we need to figure out way before we even get close to that kind of tech.
It's almost like we're already playing God with AI, but this would be on a whole other level. And you also included that article about humans maybe uploading themselves into a simulation to, like, create a utopia. It's a classic sci-fi idea, but is that really something we should be aiming for?
That's where you see some different opinions in the sources. Some say a simulated utopia, where there's no suffering or death, would be like the peak of human progress. But then others ask, would life even have meaning without challenges, without the full range of human
That's a
experience?
good point. If everything's perfect, would we even appreciate it? Would we be able to grow or evolve at all?
Right. And one of your sources even compares it to like a muscle. If you don't use it, it gets weak.
Eh,
Would the same thing happen to our minds, our spirits, even our sense of self if we were living in a perfect utopia?
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. This whole conversation is making me question what's real at all anymore. Like, look at the tech we have now. Deepfakes, AI art, virtual influencers. It's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake.
You're totally right. One of the sources calls these technologies a kind of precursor to simulated societies. It's like they're already blurring the lines, making us question everything we see and experience.
So are we already living in a kind of proto-simulated society? Okay, that's officially unsettling. But if we take this all the way, it leads to a huge question. If you are in a simulation, who's controlling it and why?
That's the ultimate mystery, right? The sources throw out a bunch of possibilities. Could be a super advanced AI, aliens, even our own descendants from the future. Maybe they're watching us, studying us, or maybe it's something way weirder that we can't even imagine.
Okay, now we're getting into X-Files territory. It's fascinating, but also kind of terrifying to think that our whole existence could just be a giant experiment, or worse, like some kind of entertainment for whoever's running the show.
It definitely makes you rethink free will and all that, and that's exactly why these conversations matter so much, even if we never really prove or disprove the simulation hypothesis.
Because it forces us to confront the big questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to be human? What do we value? How do we want to shape our future, whether it's real or simulated?
Exactly. And speaking of shaping the future, I think it's time we start talking about what all this means in the real world, because whether we're in a simulation or not, the tech we're creating right now is blurring the lines between real and virtual in some pretty major ways. Before we get into the real world stuff, there was this one source that kind of throws a wrench in the whole simulation thing. It's saying maybe this whole simulation theory is just a distraction, like a way to avoid actually dealing with all the problems we got going on right now in our, actual reality.
That's a really good point. So, okay, let's play devil's advocate for a minute.
Yeah.
What if this is all just like a big philosophy thought experiment?
Yeah.
And our reality is, well, actually real. Does that mean these conversations are like less important?
Not at all. I think the source is arguing that even if we're not, living inside a computer somewhere, the fact that we're even thinking about it says a lot about how we see technology. You
Mm.
know, we're already dealing with questions about what's real, what's fake, who we are, who's in control, all this stuff. In a world where tech is shaping how we see things and what we experience.
Yeah. It's like we're having this preemptive philosophical crisis.
Yeah.
We're already freaking out about the ethical stuff and the existential stuff that might happen as tech keeps getting more advanced. But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Right. One of your sources actually points out that thinking about simulations can be helpful, like a way to understand our own world better. Scientists are already using simulations to model stuff like climate change or how diseases spread.
So the same tech that could maybe make a simulated society is already being used to like solve real world problems. That's kind of cool. But even with the good stuff, wouldn't thinking we might be in a simulation still mess with our sense of purpose or how we see right and wrong?
That gets to a really big philosophical question. If our actions are all just part of some big algorithm, do they really matter? Does love, compassion, even suffering, would it still have meaning? One of the sources you sent, this collection of essays about consciousness and simulation, really gets into that.
It's like that whole debate about free will versus determinism, you know? But with a digital twist, this source even asked, would it be possible to like rebel against the system? Could we break free from the simulation like Neo in the Matrix?
It's a cool idea, but it also makes you wonder if we could escape, would we even want to? Especially if the simulation was made to be like a perfect utopia. No pain, no suffering.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, a perfect world sounds great, but
Yeah.
would we be giving up something essential about being human? Would we be trading free will for comfort and safety?
And that leads to another point. What if the simulation wasn't a utopia? What if it was designed to control us, to manipulate us for some reason we don't understand? One of your sources, this dystopian novel, explores that exact scenario.
Okay, now that is creepy. It's like The Truman Show meets 1984. Makes you think twice about how much control we're already giving up to technology, you know, in our own lives.
For sure. Think about social media algorithms, how they shape what we think about things. The rise of surveillance tech. All the decisions being made by AI, are these like early warning signs of a simulated society?
It's a slippery slope, no doubt.
Yeah.
But hey, there's also this source that says thinking about simulations can actually make us more proactive about shaping the future of tech.
Absolutely. This source is saying that by understanding the potential risks and ethical dilemmas of these advanced technologies, the kind that could theoretically create a simulated society, we can come up with safeguards and regulations to make sure tech serves humanity, not the other way around.
So it's about being informed, aware of the pitfalls, but also involved in shaping how these technologies are developed and used ethically.
Exactly. It's about being conscious creators of our technological future, not just passive consumers. And that brings us to another important aspect of all this, the impact of the simulation hypothesis on how we approach global challenges.
You mean things like climate change, social injustice, poverty? How would believing, or even just considering that we might be in a simulation, affect how we try to fix those problems?
That's where the sources offer some really interesting and sometimes conflicting viewpoints. Some say the simulation hypothesis could lead to apathy, Like, if it's all fake, why bother trying to change anything?
Right. Like, why recycle if it's just code anyway? But I could also see it having the opposite effect, people feeling even more responsible for their actions.
Exactly. One source suggests that the simulation hypothesis could actually inspire us to be more compassionate, more altruistic.
Hmm.
If our actions have ripple effects throughout the simulation, then every act of kindness, every effort to make things better, could actually influence the outcome of the simulation itself.
So it's like we're all playing this giant cooperative game and our choices matter. I kind of like that.
Oh,
It gives things purpose, even in a simulated world.
and it brings us back to that big question. What is the meaning of life? Whether it's in a simulation or in base reality, what's our purpose, our responsibility to ourselves and to each other?
Big questions. No easy answers. But I think just asking those questions, wrestling with these ideas, that's a good sign that we're on the right track.
I agree. It shows how important critical thinking is. Challenging assumptions, seeking out different perspectives. Whether we're living in a simulation or not, those are crucial skills for navigating a world that's getting more complex and uncertain all the time.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the more tangible, real-world implications of the simulation hypothesis. You mentioned earlier that thinking about simulations can help us understand and address real-world problems. Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. One of your sources, a report on the future of technology, talks about how simulations are being used to train AI systems to model the effects of climate change and even to develop new medical treatments.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the same tech that could theoretically create a simulated society is already being used to improve our lives in very real ways. It's like a more optimistic side to the whole simulation argument.
Precisely. And it underscores how important ethical considerations are in how we develop and use these technologies. If we're already using simulations to make life or death decisions, we need to make sure these simulations are accurate, unbiased, and aligned with our values.
It feels like we're at a crucial point where we need to be incredibly thoughtful about how we develop and use these powerful technologies, aware of the risks, but also harnessing the potential benefits.
Absolutely. And that leads to another interesting question. What happens when a simulation ends? Is it just deleted? Is there some kind of afterlife for simulated beings?
Whoa, now we're getting deep. It's like the digital version of heaven and hell.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder if we knew our simulated lives were temporary, would we live them differently?
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? Would we take more risks? Would we focus more on experiences and relationships instead of material things? Would we be more driven to leave a positive impact on the simulated world around us?
These are questions that really make you think about what's truly important in life. And they remind us that even if our reality is just a simulation, the choices we make, the connections we form, the love we share it, all has meaning and value within that context.
Well said. And it brings us back to the core message of this deep dive. It all comes back to this. Whether our reality is like the base reality or some crazy advanced simulation, the important thing is to live a life with purpose, with connection, with a sense of wonder.
I love that. And it's funny, you included this one source that says the simulation hypothesis, even if it's not true, can actually help us grow as people.
Right. This source suggests that just thinking about the possibility of a simulated existence can help us detach from material possessions. Focus more on experiences and relationships and appreciate the simple things in life.
So instead of making people apathetic or nihilistic, it could actually inspire them to live more fully and meaningfully in the present moment.
Exactly. If everything's a simulation, then what really matters is the quality of our experiences, the strength of our connections, and the positive impact we have on the other beings around us, even if they're digital.
It reminds us that even in a simulated world, we still have the power to choose how we live, how we treat each other, and how we shape our own reality.
And that brings us back to the practical implications of all this. You had that really interesting article about how the simulation hypothesis is showing up in tech or even fashion.
Oh, yeah. This article was talking about how designers are creating virtual clothes and stuff for avatars. Artists are building these immersive digital worlds. And even architects are designing buildings specifically for virtual reality.
It's like the physical and digital worlds are blending together in ways we couldn't have imagined a few years ago. And it makes you think about the future of identity, ownership, self-expression in a world where we can just move between real and virtual environments whenever we want.
It's like our digital selves are becoming just as important, if not more important, than our physical selves. And it makes you wonder, what will the metaverse be like in a few decades? Will we be spending more time in simulated environments than in the real world?
It's a real possibility. And your sources talk about it with a mix of excitement and caution. On the one hand, these virtual worlds offer amazing opportunities for creativity, connection, exploration.
Like imagine being able to visit anywhere in the world, experience any historical event, even fly through space, all from your living room. The possibilities are mind-blowing.
They are, but we also have to be aware of the potential downsides. Your sources warn about things like addiction, social isolation, losing real-world skills and experiences.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Enjoying the possibilities of virtual worlds, but also staying connected to the real world and the people in it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
using these technologies as tools to grow, connect, explore, not letting them replace real-world experiences and relationships.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I think the most important thing is whether we're living in a simulation or not. The questions raised by the simulation hypothesis push us to live more consciously, more purposefully, and more connected to the world around us.
It's about embracing the mystery, staying curious, and always questioning the nature of reality. And ultimately, it's about using our time and energy to make a positive difference, whether that's in the digital world or the physical world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.